Okay, Leanne, I think we can go ahead and get started. You're on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, great. Do you need to make you need to make some opening comments, right? No? All right. Well, I will. So welcome back to this meeting of the CASAC Ozone panel for the purposes of deliberating on our consensus comments and letter to the administrator, the draft dated May 2nd, 2023. At the end of our meeting yesterday, we had worked our way through all of the consensus comments, thankfully. We still needed to create drafts of Appendix B, our response to EPA's May 18th request for clarification, and Appendix C, the committee's rebuttal to the dissenting opinion. Thanks to many extra hours devoted by Aaron and a small group of panelists, we now have drafts of those documents, which have been made public. Also, yesterday, we identified a few places in our consensus responses that we wanted to return to, particularly regarding Chapter 4 and the secondary standard. Today, due to the panelists' availability, we will address those Chapter 4 changes to the consensus responses first, followed by the Chapter 4 sections of our letter. Then we will review our consensus responses to EPA's request for clarification, starting with their item number 4, which is the first topic pertaining to the secondary standard. There are a few places in Chapter 3 where we may want to revisit in our consensus responses, including a paragraph from my individual comments that I propose inserting. Assuming it looks like we will have adequate time to review the rest of our letter after Appendix B, we will turn to our draft of Appendix B next. Then we will finish the remaining parts of the letter, starting at the beginning page L1, and also taking up the very ending text on page L5. Last, we will work on a rebuttal to the dissenting opinion. We will be working primarily from the May 2nd version of our draft report, as well as the drafts of Appendix B and Appendix C that were made public this morning. Aaron Yao will be sharing screen. Periodically, he will show a track changes version of our draft report to facilitate understanding. We will continue to refer to page and line numbers in the public versions of these documents. First, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Boylan, who wishes to take a few minutes to address the panel.
All right. Hi. Thanks, Leanne. Yes, I wanted to start out today by making a statement. I would like to redact my statement I made yesterday where I stated that the EPA administrator had cherry-picked CASAC members with known perspectives to support a political agenda. I really don't know how the EPA administrator selects the members for CASAC, and I feel that all members on the CASAC in the panel are highly qualified experts in their respective fields who have earned their appointment based on merit. It was not my intention to offend anyone yesterday, and if I did, I wanted to apologize. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jim. So now we're going to turn to the Chapter 4 consensus responses, which start on page 12 and line 4 of the consensus comments. And it might be most efficient if I invite, Alexandra, can you take the lead on the places that we need to discuss, since you and your team worked hard on cleaning that up and making edits yesterday, and we can ask Aaron to share screen for the edited version as needed.
So yeah, I was going to ask about that. If you could share the screen rather than me trying to do that simultaneously, that would be helpful.
Okay, so should this be the strikeout version?
I think so, yes. We should, if we can, try to identify the places in this document where it was in the May 2nd version. That would be helpful. I actually can probably do that from my printed copy to help out.
And Leanne, if it's okay with you, I just want to invite the other panel members who we were all working together on this, to jump in if there's something that I miss along the way.
Oh, absolutely. My vision is that I'm only asking you to take the lead, but certainly not to represent other people. So it looks to me like the first place was on page 12, lines 38 and 39. Which looks like, yeah, that's the right place where Aaron's showing. It's now the edits that are on lines 2 to 3, it looks like.
Yes. So another one clarification. Should we go over minor editorial changes?
Oh,
Or
no.
more substantive?
No, we don't need to do that. Sorry, I'm just my notes don't distinguish. So go
No,
ahead.
that's perfect. So this is just a minor editorial change. I think we can probably move forward.
Yeah, so the next section is on page 13, the paragraph that starts on line 17 and ends on line 28. That was the CASAC notes, the summary conclusions. That was, so Aaron, you're one paragraph too far, I think. Oh, there weren't any changes in that. Is that right?
That's correct. I think it's
Okay.
the next paragraph is some editorial changes that we made in response to one of the public comments yesterday. And we've simply adapted the wording to make this paragraph clearer for all readers.
Thank you. And though that for the May 2nd version of the report is page 13, lines 30 through 38 that we're talking about the edits in that paragraph. So yeah, there's
correct.
Probably nothing there to discuss because it was just more rewriting for clarity, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, and then based on my notes, I think the next one was on page 15, lines 1 to 11, paragraph that started on the previous page was with the methodologies employed. Is that, did changes get made to that? I'm sorry, I'm looking at notes. That was
They did, but we might be out of sync. So I'm just referring to the document. Maybe those are coming later.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm confused about the page numbers that you're talking about as well.
So because the version of our report that is public is the May 2nd version.
Oh, okay.
Trying to help people recognize where the report we are talking about. This track changes version is to help us facilitate digesting the changes since there were a bunch of them. But the panelists is certainly welcome to look at the track change version because that should be more straightforward. So maybe I should not, I should just be looking at what you're showing on the screen and then identifying where it is in the May 2nd version. So where are we? All right, so the large revised text on the page is on the May 2nd report is page 14, lines 4 through 14. And so I don't know if there's anything you want to mention about this, Alex, about the thrust of the edits that you made.
So here I would invite Judy to contribute if she would like to discuss this comment here that was added by her.
Yeah, this was discussed yesterday.
Okay.
Yeah, we've done this part.
Okay.
About how EPA discounting the influence of ozone on climate.
Okay, and that was what you had made public in advance too, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
All right, so I don't think we need to go into any more details about that.
Right.
All right, is there anything on this paragraph? It starts with the methodologies that you want to discuss, Alex?
That's correct. And it's actually not that paragraph per se, but rather we elaborate on using the median percent approach in the following paragraph. And here I would like to invite Howie and or Donica to discuss the paragraph that we've added here.
Yeah, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly where this is on the can you scroll up a little bit, Aaron, so I can figure out exactly where we are on the May 2nd version? Oh, here, it's okay, it's line, the top of the page is the paragraph that starts on line 42 of page 14 and ends on page 15, line 11. And then there's an inserted paragraph right after that. That's what we're looking at. So we're waiting for Donica Howie to chime in, is that right?
Yeah, or Danica, if she's there. What we were just doing in this paragraph, and I think is that we're just sort of explaining why we were moving away from using the median and going more with what the Lee et al. Paper recommended with species that had losses less than 5% as being sensitive, and using that level for the W126 standard. So this is just sort of a more complete explanation, a better explanation why we did that.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this is very similar to the text that was in the comments that we contributed to, that you shared, Leanne.
Okay, so that's very similar to text that we're proposing for Appendix B, is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that clarification. So people have had a chance to look at that also. Okay, looks like we can continue on.
So Leanne, I think I had a comment here that maybe we need to check with to see if this is all CASAC, if this is consensus, or all CASAC except for one or whoever else does not agree.
Thank you for reminding us about that comment. Does anyone have a problem with this text or wish to provide a dissent?
This is Jim. I wonder if we could say in the first sentence, instead of is not a useful way, because, you know, I do think it can be useful. It maybe is not the best way to summarize the results. And if we said that, I would be okay with that.
Yeah, and that's fine with me.
Yeah, that's fine with me also.
I also went back and forth with his useful
Fine
stuff.
with me.
What was that? Was that Donica?
No, but I did say that it was fine.
Somebody said they went back and forth. I guess I.
Oh, on the not a useful way. I think I wrote that and I went back and forth on as to whether that was the right wording, but I was in a bit of a rush, and so I didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. I'm
Okay.
happy to accept Jim's suggestion.
Okay, great. So we have consensus with that minor wording change. Great. Appreciate that, and thank you for the reminder, Aaron. Okay, so this paragraph that starts with specifically is on the May 2nd document on page 16, lines 4 to 15. And so I invite Alex or whoever in the group wants to tell us whatever about why these changes were made.
It's a minor editorial change, but it appears multiple times throughout the document. So I think it's worth mentioning that we reworded the text here just to indicate that the current standard, in our view, does not provide sufficient protection against adverse impacts, not only on ecosystem functioning broadly, but also adverse impacts on growth in sensitive plants, as well as in annual and perennial herbaceous plants and in crops. So we're trying to be more specific about the variety of plants that could be affected. And I think that is the thrust of that comment, but we did just change that wording to be more inclusive and more clear in our intent.
Thank you. And I think you made that suggested change in the letter as well. Okay. So the next paragraph is in the May 2nd document on page 16, lines 17 through 26.
So here we decided to delete the phrase that talks about compounding over time for a couple of reasons. As EPA notes, there's not a whole lot of studies to show compound events, but perhaps more important, as was raised yesterday in the public comments, well, there are different interpretations of the word compounding effects. And we felt the best approach was, if we don't have clarity on how the different, how we and others are using that term, it would be best to leave that piece of the phrase out for the moment. And then in the end of the paragraph, we're addressing a public comment yesterday that highlights that if we are considering that the species included do represent the range of ozone sensitivity as indicated in the PA, then we would anticipate impacts on other species to be significant. So we have made that note in the text here. And I think that's it for this paragraph.
Leanne, you're muted.
Oh,
So sorry. The next paragraph looks like it's minor editorial, the one that starts with all CASAC members. So it doesn't look like we need to discuss it. Next is the paragraph starting for the averaging time, which in the May 2nd version is lines 1 to 5 on page 17.
sure. And here what we're doing is just providing some more support for the statement that we're advocating for single rather than a 3-year averaging time, essentially highlighting that annual plants will only be affected by a single year of ozone exposure.
Okay, thank you. Moving on. The paragraph that starts these CASAC members is on page 17, lines 19 through 26.
Here we've just added a note from the public comments yesterday, highlighting the effect of ozone on class 1 areas.
Thank you. And then the text that starts with however one CASAC member is a replacement for the text that was on page 17, starting on line 33. I don't know if there's anything we specifically need to deliberate on with respect to this, since it's a one person's point of view. However, I want to say that in suggesting there could be one sentence, this is pretty long. And my intent was not that it would be a long paragraph, but that it would be a very brief mention of the key points. So I would encourage Jim to think about how to shorten this, because the purpose of the dissent is to provide the details. But we don't need to, I don't think we need to deliberate this, because this part of the text is well, it's not really consensus, but I guess on the other hand, if other panelists have points of view, this is a consensus document, so that should be brought up.
this is the first time I'm seeing the comment, so perhaps those of us who are participating in these edits could take a minute to just read the paragraph and formulate some thoughts. Would that be okay?
Absolutely.
And just from a grammatical thing, there's a word missing in the very first part of the first sentence. I think, Jim, you meant to say that one CASAC member agrees with the EPA staff preliminary conclusion.
Yeah, yes, thank you for catching that.
Mm-hmm.
And this was sent out this morning as well and posted on the meeting webpage as a draft appendix C.
Right. So at the beginning of draft appendix C, there are the suggested edits to our report as well.
Leanne, could I ask a question regarding this?
Please.
Yeah, and it would be to Jim. Later down, Jim, when you're talking about the inappropriateness of this recommendation here, you have one section that says doesn't account for all elements of the standard. And then it says the way the attainment with the standard is determined, that is the highest design value in the CBSA. Could you explain that phrase? Because I'm not quite familiar with what you're trying to say.
Yeah, so basically the way attainment with the standard is determined is by the highest design value in an area. And so, for example, I think one of the plots, I forget which figure, it had a map of W126s and it was of the whole US. And if you looked in Georgia, in Atlanta, there was one red dot for the high monitor in downtown Atlanta. And then the rest of the dots spread out through Atlanta were blue dots. So, you know, the one high monitor in downtown Atlanta basically defines the design value for the whole MSA across Atlanta, although those other monitors could be well below the design value. And so, you know, the fact that one monitor, that just represents one little piece of the MSA having the high value, whereas the rest of the MSA is going to have a completely different concentration distribution, both temporally and spatially. And so that's what is meant by that, is that, you know, one value doesn't mean the whole MSA is at that one high value. It's one high value at one place, but could be much monitor that's basically area. That's the point of that.
So when something like that happens, how do we handle a situation like that?
Well, the whole area is designated non-attainment. I mean, if one out of the 9 monitors is violating the standard, basically the whole area gets designated non-attainment for the standard.
But is this a problem specific to this secondary standard that we're recommending, or
No,
because it seems to me it could apply to the primary standard too, right?
It applies to the primary standard, and it applies to all the pollutants. I mean, this is basically how it's done for all pollutants and primary and secondary standards. And I guess the point is, you know, the only way to account for these spatial distributions is to run it through a model. And that's what the risk and exposure assessment does. And it accounts for concentration distributions temporally and spatially. And it also looks at, you know, the highest monitor, for example, in Atlanta is downtown Atlanta. You know, there's less density of trees and crops and plants in downtown Atlanta than in the more rural areas of Atlanta, where the concentrations are much lower. So the risk and exposure assessment can account for all that, and then basically look at a overall impact of a set design value at the current standard as well as alternative standards, and then look at how the impact changes.
So one comment I have, and I welcome input from experts at EPA as well. I mean, we are a scientific advisory committee, and we don't address attainment in our advice. Donica.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to derail your point, and I don't, if others want to respond to that before I ask
Well, I'll just respond to what Leanne said. I mean, I know we don't address attainment, but that's what the standard is, and this is how the design value is used. And I mean, this, in my opinion, needs to be accounted for, because this is how attainment with the standard is achieved. And as a result of attainment with the standard, these are the concentration distributions that result, that end up having the impacts on the vegetative species. So, and in the primary standard, in the primary standard, you look at where the people are compared to where the ozone is in the exposure assessment. So,
Yeah, so sticking to the task at hand, which is and again, if anybody at EPA feels like it's important to weigh in on this attainment discussion, I appreciate that. But sticking to the task at hand, I think your main point is one that I've understood in your more recent comments, which is the fact that that you think a lot more weight needs to be put on the risk and exposure assessment, which is consistent with your mention about attainment, because that's part of looking at the modeling and the spatial distribution and so on. And I think that's a very important point of view that you want to bring forward. I think you can do that a lot more briefly in this document, because you have the opportunity to provide the details in your dissent. So I strongly encourage that this gets shortened. When I said one sentence about the key points yesterday, I wasn't thinking of a sentence that was a paragraph long. I was thinking of something quite brief. So obviously we need to work on the policy for how we're going to handle dissent and how much attention we're going to give it in the main documents. Looking at the scientific advisory board reports, they don't even mention anything about the dissenting point of view. That is all in the appendix. So this is going further in one direction than the examples we've been given. So, Mark.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you, Leanne. I mean, this is basically an involved argument that's going to end up duplicating, I assume, what's going to be in the appendix. And the appendix is the place where Jim is going to have the room to provide the argument in detail. I would suggest, in order to move on, that we just include the first sentence, which is a long sentence, but stating that Jim agrees with the EPA staff's findings here, and then a second sentence just to refer to the appendix for the details of the argument.
And I think if Aaron scrolls down, that's already there and just not visible on the screen.
I mean, the other thing I do think me being able to make a comment about the other members' recommendation, I mean, I could cut it down to just after saying the other members, basically the second sentence is inappropriate, should not be viewed with skepticism because it does not have a welfare risk and exposure assessment period. Would that be short enough?
Well, that was what I was looking for when I suggested it yesterday.
Okay, I can do that. I mean, you can use what I just said, or I can send it in. I can send it in to make sure we get the wording right. But that sounds like it'd be short enough for you.
That's much more in line with what I was thinking of. I mean, we could go further, as Mark just suggested, but if we stick with what we were talking about yesterday, that's more consistent with what I was thinking.
Okay,
And-
I'll cut it down to what I just said and send that in.
Alex.
Yes, I just wanted to circle back to Donica because I think Donica had a question for Jen.
Oh, appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. So related to, I guess I'm not entirely sure that I understand your explanation to Howie, the full explanation, but I guess what I wanted to loop back to, was the point of where the people are versus where the plants are. And, if you have non-attainment for the secondary standard in an urban area where there really aren't that many plants, or I don't know, it's an interesting point. And I guess I don't know that we have the capacity, or that our recommendation has the capacity to address that, but it is something that I think probably does need to be considered in the secondary standard, that the non-attainment areas, I wonder if they should have a certain fraction of vegetation, or, something like that. Because I think that would address your comment. But I guess the other thing that I'm wondering, I find the language inappropriate and extreme skepticism quite strong. And we have not called anything that you have said inappropriate. And so I'm wondering if you would be willing to consider toning that language down a little bit.
Well, I think you've called a lot of things inappropriate that EPA has done, and which I'm supporting. So I think you have, throughout the whole letter.
There's nowhere in this letter that it says the EPA is inappropriate.
It might be, we should do a search on that. There might be something about inappropriate to rely exclusively on the controlled human exposure studies. I think we do say something like that. That's I think maybe a little bit different flavor than what you're reacting to, but yeah, that's more like a decision.
The scientific inappropriate, like the appropriateness of applying a scientific method might be a little bit different than calling a recommendation inappropriate.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. And, in general, as scientists, when we criticize, we're criticizing the work and not the people. And so I think that's kind of what you're getting at in your comments, is to make sure that we're sticking to the science in our criticisms and not veering into it, making look like it's any kind of an opinion about the individuals.
So I can change it to is not supported by a risk and exposure assessment.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of language that Donica's looking for. All right, I think we had enough discussion on this topic. Is there anything else in this section that we need to talk about? Howie, or it's not Howie, Aaron, would you move down and see if there's anything more? I think there was something about greenhouse gases at the end. Yeah, so that's in front of us, starting on line 5, and in our May 2nd version of the report, it is on page 18, line 34 to 39. Christina.
I would just like to ask if Aaron can zoom in a little bit so it's a little easier to read. Thank you.
So these edits were made by Jason. So if Jason's here, maybe he could just elaborate on his comments.
Sure. There was 2 points. One was to note that it's a greenhouse gas. The ozone is a greenhouse gas, which I do in the first sentence now. Then the second point, having a hard time reading it. And also, I'm sorry, can somebody read it out to me?
Sure, I can. So the second point says, since global ozone concentrations through the depth of the troposphere impact climate, the CASAC agrees with the EPA that it is not straightforward to relate concentrations of ozone at the ground at specific locations with climate changes from ozone.
So our language before just said ground level, relating ground level ozone with climate impacts, which was maybe a little bit hard to internalize. And so that phrase to begin the sentence was intended to clarify that a bit. Hopefully that works for people.
Yeah.
This is Michelle. I think that's improved language.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, Jason. So I guess the last thing, there's just Alex, did you want to comment on the new text that's at the end of charge question 2 or not, or just?
This is just a summary, I guess, of the most important points, take-home messages, headlines that of what we were stating in the previous paragraphs.
Great, thank you. And then I think that's pretty much it, except for maybe there's a couple of bullets that got edited. I don't know that we need much attention to them. There was one, I guess these 2 were added. Is there anything, Donica?
That was just based on a comment yesterday that perhaps additional research should focus on some of the national park areas. And so I added that, and as well as one of the points that the National Park Service also brought up is that in some regions, nighttime ozone and early morning ozone are contributing. And so additional research needs to be included on that as well.
Great, thank you. So unless there's further discussion on our consensus comments, we're going to consider chapter 4 done. And due to panelist availability, I now ask you to switch gears and move to the letter. This is starting in the letter on page L3, line 28 is where chapter 4 starts. And yeah, I think there were some edits to this as well. So I'll go through, I'll mention it because we haven't reviewed and discussed this. Erin's showing in front of us the track change version, which already has proposed edits, a lot of them based on the brought forward from what was changed in the consensus comments and a few other odds and ends of things that panelists have sent in. So I will mention based on the pages and line numbers in the May 2nd version where we are, but we'll look at each paragraph separately. But before we do, Judy, you have a comment.
Yeah. Could you scroll back to line 41? I think this, I don't know if it's this version. I can see the start in the paragraph with the PA provides a clear presentation.
Are you talking about
page 1, L1, back to page letter 1.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Sure, page L1.
Yeah.
That's line
9, originally 941. Yeah, here.
Yes.
The starting the paragraph with PA provides a clear presentation of information on air quality. I recommend to add the second sentence between the CASAC recommends continuous year-round ozone monitoring nationwide to provide to better represent human exposures and protect public health and the ecosystems, public welfare and ecosystem.
Okay, thank you, Judy. And we will so appreciate you sending that in as well. We will be circling back to the beginning of the letter.
Okay.
to make sure that we get to the chapter 4 part of the letter because of panelist availability. So, George, did you want to, what did you want to say?
Well, I had a comment on the next paragraph. Is that appropriate now?
On page L2? No, I want to wait.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, the next paragraph, the next paragraph from what's on the screen.
Yeah, yeah, we'll get to that later. I want to make sure that we cover chapter 4 while Howie's here.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. I'm confused.
So
This
I'm
paragraph-
asking everybody to start on page L3, line 28. We will go back to the beginning of the letter later.
No, that's yeah. I'm talking line page L3, line 35 to 43.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Hence my confusion. Yeah, in the PA, the EPA, that paragraph. There you go. So
Okay.
halfway down, it says, although the current standard is expected to result in lower severity and incidence of visible foliar injury, it does not, etc. So lower severity and incidence of visible foliar injury than what is like there's something missing there.
Okay, yeah, so that's helpful. Maybe people with expertise in this area could suggest different wording.
The simplest thing I could think to do would be just to simply change lower to low, since lower implies you have to compare it to something else.
Okay. Does that work for you, George?
I'm sorry, Howie, could you say that again?
I was just changing the word lower to low, because that's what it does.
Well, okay, yeah, the low, well, it's still a little strange to me, but because it seems like it's a relative statement, but it's not a big deal, but it's just confusing, even with just result in low severity. It's not important, but.
Or perhaps reduced, but I didn't raise my hand, perhaps reduced, although if that's still relative, you might.
It's still relative, so the question is relative to what?
Reduce severity incidence in plant populations as compared to areas where ozone levels exceed the secondary standard. Would something like that work?
Okay, well, yeah, that's more clear, yeah.
Okay, I'll jot that down before that goes away from my brain.
Okay, thank you.
And throw that out there with everyone and see what thinks.
Judy, you have your hand up. Oh, you don't have your hand up anymore. Okay. So the rest of the changes in this paragraph, now we're on page L3, line 35, the paragraph that ends on page L4, line 5. This is in the May 2nd version of the document. The rest of the changes, I think, are completely consistent with what we just talked about in the consensus comment. Okay. And then moving on to page L4, the paragraph that starts on line 7 at a W126 index value and ends on line 15.
We've actually discussed all of these changes already, so I think we can.
Great. And this is, again, the letter is summarizing what's in our consensus comments. And so these edits have been brought forward from that. All right, we're moving on to the paragraph that starts with based on, which is the letter L4, line 17 through 30. And these are also edits that were made based on some of the things that were changed in the consensus comments. Does anybody else have any other suggestions or comments for this? Okay, moving on L4, lines 32 through 36. That's for the oh, and we're seeing now on the screen the rest of the previous paragraph, but again, those were brought forward from the consensus comments. So we're now looking at what on May 2nd was page L4, lines 32 through 36. And there were no major edits to that. And then what was started on page L4, line 38 was the dissenting opinion, went through L5, line 8. And based on our discussion, the new text will be considerably shortened. And I actually would propose that in the letter that we don't go into the reasons at all, that we save that for the consensus comments and of course the dissent, so that we basically have, as Mark recommended for the consensus comments, we have the opening sentence and then the reference to the appendix C. So that would strike everything starting that's on the screen in front of us, that starts on line 31 and ends in the middle of line 37. Jim.
I mean, I would think it would be good to be consistent between what's in the charge question letter and or response and what's in this letter.
Well, I think we are being consistent and recognize the letter as a distilled version of the consensus comments. So that's consistent with what we've done throughout the entire document, is distilling it. So not saying everything we say in the consensus comments. That's the point of the letter, is that it's briefer.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you. All right, moving on. The next paragraph is in L5, lines 10 through 15 in the May 2nd version. I think you've gone a little too far, Aaron. Yeah, starts on line 41 here. Make sure with the experts that we've brought forward everything. It doesn't look to me that this has some of the changes that we made that maybe are important. But I asked the climate experts to, particularly Jason, to weigh in on whether there are any changes to this letter that are needed based on edits we made to the consensus comments.
I don't want to overstep because this is Jason's area, but I think this actually looks okay.
Okay. All right. Well, and I think,
I-
go ahead, Judy.
Yeah, I think it probably should be more consistent with the consensus report, especially at the sentence ground level with a specific location. That's why Jason added it with climate change. At
Okay.
ground level on line 1, L-6.
Yeah,
I don't. Right?
we could change it slightly to say that, and then
Yeah.
I had changed the language. Instead of insufficient later, I said I changed it to currently insufficient, just to leave the door open to say that there may be sufficient information at some point in the future. But
Okay.
Jim had a comment as well, maybe.
All right, so we will not lengthen this so much as just tweak it a little bit to make it more consistent with the edits that are in the consensus comments. We can do that offline. I think that I think that that's probably enough for the public deliberation, because our intent is clear. So the last sentence, that's, on line 5 is just about future research. I want to come back to the rest of the letter so that we, also discuss Appendix B, the secondary standard part of Appendix B. So, and Jim, your hand is up. I'm assuming it's left over, but maybe not. Okay. So now this morning, Aaron sent out a draft of Appendix B, and the public version has line and page numbers. And so I would like us to move, I think, Aaron, you pasted that into this report. I would like us to move to the secondary standard part of our responses to EPA, which is in Appendix B. So in the document that was sent this morning, the secondary standard starts on page 5.
So Leanne, I would suggest just working off the public version, since there's no track changes, then there's no need to.
Okay, all right, all
And
right.
this way we don't need to labor in cross-referencing.
Okay, all right, that's good comment, thank you. So we're on the bottom of page 5, line 39 is where the secondary standard starts, and this was EPA's request for clarification on why nonlinearity and exposure response functions would call into question the use of the median value. And so starting on page 6, line 1 through line 23, we have our response to that. And so we can start with the first paragraph and just see if any members of the panel have any suggested changes. I do want to say that this is a distilled, actually not very distilled. This part of it, I think, is verbatim from what was shared as my individual comments prior to yesterday's meeting. And this was worked on by the secondary standard group. I really appreciate you all stepping up and doing this in short order. And so it's already gone through a fair amount of expert review and revision. So just as context for people who are listening in. So I'm not hearing any suggested changes. Jason, you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a quick point. It just seems a little strange to be quoting one member of the group from that person's individual comments rather than just making that point. But perhaps it doesn't matter too much.
Well, we could easily edit it. I think this is because I was drafting it first and I didn't know how to write it. So I just took her statement. So I invite the experts, if you, instead of quoting Dr. Lombardozzi, if you would prefer to just make it our own statement, we could just take the quotes off if everybody agrees with it. I think that, Jason, that is that's a good point. And it's an artifact of how quickly we were trying to put this together.
Sure.
Terry.
Maybe it's me, but I'm not getting the first sentence. I've reread it a few times and it seems like we're agreeing that median value is okay. And then we go on to say it's not useful. I'm just.
Yeah, so maybe we need to further flesh that out. I know that this has been my understanding, and I'm not the expert, see if I can say it in general, that use of a median is not a problem. It's that the way it was done across species in the analysis that was done in the policy assessment provided some counterintuitive results that were problematic. That's my personal summary of that, and maybe one of the experts could chime in and help us out a little bit.
That sounds logical to me. It's just I don't get that from those first two sentences.
Donica.
Oops, sorry. Hit unmute and then mute again really quickly. I think the first sentence was just in regards to the direct response to the question. And so that's part of the reason why it comes out like that, because EPA was asking why there was a problem with using the median. And inherently, there's nothing wrong using the median. It's just that using the median produced some inconsistent results. But then on top of that, I think if I can speak for the panel, I think the panel agrees that using the median is not protective enough of sensitive species, because still half of all plants will be impacted at a biomass loss of 5% or greater. And so that's, I think the latter point is even, at least in my opinion, is a more important, or is a very important reason why we shouldn't be using the median specifically, rather than
that's all clear. It's the first sentence.
Yeah,
that I'm talking about. It says we don't question using median value, and then all of a sudden we are questioning it.
I think that, I think that, no, you're interpreting that sentence wrong. I think
the form of the exposure response.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry if I butted in, but the way that I'm seeing the screen here, I can't see myself to raise a hand. The sentence is just simply saying that if you have a linear response or a nonlinear response, it doesn't matter, because that doesn't bring in to question using the median value. And then we say, okay, so that's just from a statistical point of view. And then we're saying, now you could use the median value, but we are saying, as Danica said, that we don't think that protects enough plants. Does that clear that up, or is that still confusing?
That's clear. But when I read that sentence, it's just one of those, if I have to read it 2 or 3 or 4 times, it doesn't appear clear. So I assumed that it was talking about a specific exposure response curve that was in the PA. And that curve, we weren't questioning using the median value. That's all.
Yeah, so we clearly need to make some edits. Maybe Alex is going to help us with this.
I was just going to say it might be helpful to scroll up and show EPA's question. I think when we see them together, it may not be so counterintuitive, the response.
Yeah, and this was my distillate, just to clarify for everyone listening, this was my distillation of their question. We're going to put in Appendix A the full depth of their request, which was longer than this, but I don't remember the details about each one. It sounds to me like we need to make some edits to satisfy Terry's criterion that he shouldn't have to read a sentence 3 times to understand what we mean. But we can probably do that offline. George.
Well, I was just going to say, to make Terry happy, the CASAC agrees with the EPA that in general, comma, the form of.
Okay.
That's good.
I was going to suggest, I'm sorry, switching it around so that the CASAC agrees with the EPA that in general the median value could be used, and that exposure response curve nonlinearity does not invalidate it, something like that.
Perfect.
That's even better. Jason, if you don't mind emailing that to Aaron and me, that will make sure that we don't garble it.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, that was a helpful discussion. Michael.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that part of what we could do is after the words median value, line 2, change the period to a comma, and then go on with however. So put both thoughts into the one sentence.
Okay, that's a thought. Danica?
Yeah, that's fine with me. I also wanted to highlight here, Jim had earlier pointed out that maybe we should change the phrase "is not a useful way." And so we might want to make that change here as well. I think I can't remember exactly what he had recommended, but using the median percent reduction
Is not the best way.
is not the best way. Yeah, there you go. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Yeah, we'll make that change. Thanks for bringing that forward. All right, have we finished with this paragraph? And we'll move on to the one that starts on line 17 through 20. Well, we might as well go to the end of this section. Do you want to scroll down a little bit, Aaron? Thank you. 17 through 23. So, one comment I want to make is that I ask all of us to make sure that we've made, I think in this case, we already talked about this today. We have made the changes we need to make in our report about the use of the median. But in general, we are now in this appendix saying we've made these changes, and particularly for the primary standard, we need to make sure that we caught everything. So that's an important note for all of us. And that even if we don't manage to catch them all in this public meeting, our intent is to make all those changes, and we will continue to look for them after the public meeting. So just a small comment that applies across Appendix B and our report. Anything else on this one? We'll move on to number 5 then.
Could I make a comment? Just a typo in that paragraph.
Sure.
In the third line, you referred to Lee et al. 2020. That should be 2022.
Oh, thank you. Good. Appreciate that. Well, moving on to EPA's request number 5 and our response, which is on lines 29 through 40. And we might want to change this on line 35. We didn't clarify our comments about compounding. We removed them. So that's probably a change we want to make on line 39. All right, moving on to number 6. So EPA made a clarification about its evaluation of RYL for annual crops. And we have a brief clarification at the top of page 7, lines 1 to 6. And mostly just highlighting what we think is important with respect to this point. Okay, I think we are done with this part of Appendix B. I know we've been jumping around quite a bit. And that's so we make sure that we covered all the secondary standard topics in the first 2 hours of today's meeting. I'm thinking that given that we're already in Appendix B, we maybe go back to the beginning of it and do the primary standard piece of it before we go back to our report. That's a little bit different order than I suggested earlier, but I think that'll be a little bit less jumping around. So we're now on, where are we? Page 1. And so for the primary standard, the way this got drafted by me and then vetted by a number of panelists, which I greatly appreciated, I made a general statement about their request for this, in this case, number 1, which was focused on the clinical evidence. And then we provided some preliminary comments about the controlled human exposure evidence in this document, and then went on to respond specifically to their items 1A, B, and C. So let's first talk about this part of this broadly, and then the specifics. George.
There was a discussion about inserting the word alone, so possibly on line 21 here, but alone are not useful for concluding ... That was a topic that we had Terry and I and others had, and you, I think, had discussed.
Yes, and I was looking for where that needed to go, but didn't find that last night. So thank you for bringing that up, because I was sure it needed to go in here somewhere, and I didn't identify it. So
yeah, the middle of line 21,
right.
But alone are not useful.
Okay, so we'll add alone, because that was a very important conversation we had yesterday. Thank you. Ed.
I would just suggest that rather in that same line, rather than using useful, I would say sufficient.
Okay. We'll make that change too. These are one word, but these are really important single words. So good to get them in public. Jennifer.
In a similar vein, I would suggest here and throughout that we've had this discussion about saying adverse health effect rather than just effect.
Right. So add adverse wherever we say if health effect or effect. That's different from like statistically significant effect, which is on line 22. That's not what you're talking about. You're talking about like line 23, evidence of an effect. You mean evidence of an adverse effect, for instance.
Correct. Right.
Okay. We'll do that. And again, people are welcome to, send in track changes or comments on the PDF if you would like to identify specifics. Make sure we get all the details right. Jeremy.
Yeah, just line 23, same idea here. I'd say CHE study is not necessarily evidence or does not necessarily provide evidence of absence of policy, so again, just kind of soften the language a bit.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's line 23. All right, thank you. So we've had a good, robust discussion with a lot of small but very important changes to the paragraph lines 17 to 25. Maybe we'll move now to the first bullet, line 27 through 33. Also add in lines 34 through 40. Adding in lines 41 on page 1 through, well, maybe we can just go all the way to the end of these bullets on line 7, if we can show them almost. Ed.
Yes, so on line 41, just for clarification, I think a better word rather than purified would be highly filtered,
Okay.
wherever we talk about controlled human exposures.
I would differ from that, Ed. Actually, I was the one that suggested purified because it's not just filtered. You need to, I mean, filtered is to remove the particles, but you also need the purifil to remove the gases.
Well, that's true, but to me, purified suggests that we removed, it's purified in the sense that maybe I'm going too extreme, that purified to the extent removes everything. And I don't think it's clear, it's clean, free of everything. I think we just filtered out some of the gases, some of the particulates.
Yeah, but you don't really filter the gases. I guess it's just a technical term. I think to some people, the word filtered is going to raise questions that we didn't remove the gases, the excess ozone and NO2 and stuff that may be part of the indoor air that we absorb rather than filter. So that's why purified. I'm not stuck on the word purified, but I think if we just say filtered, it's going to be misconstrued by a few people.
All right. Well, I'll defer to your many more years of control chamber
Scrubbed air.
I mean, you could say clean air, or
no, because clean is too obscure. I'll step back. Purified is okay.
Thank you. That's good perspective, even if it doesn't make it into our written comments. And Ed, you might add something about that in your individual comments, just so it's in the record, and with the exchange with Mark. It wouldn't hurt, just so that everybody understands that the subtle differences between the ideas behind purified and filtered.
Yes, I will do so. And I also have a couple of just small wordsmithing, editing recommendations on those previous bullets above. I don't think they're worth arguing about here, but I'll submit them.
Appreciate that. So I think we're ready to move on to 1A. And I also didn't hear any concerns about having this broad summary that we just discussed before going into the specific requests. So that I just wanted to state that. So EPA wanted a request about clarification about children. And so this lines 15 through 31 are our draft. And I took out some details that we had that we submitted as part of my individual comments before. I've also, I think it's this section I got from Catherine Carr, some clarification. So I've got some an edited version of my individual comments, which will go in the report as individual comments with additional details. I've got a track change version that we don't need to talk about in public because it's an individual comment, but made those changes, just so you know. And see if anybody has any additional comments or changes for this section on children. I also noted that we said we re-edited the report, and this is again a place where hopefully we've already caught everything, but if not, we'll be looking for it and making additional changes to reflect what we're saying on lines 20 through 23. Mark.
Yes, I made a note to myself here that I'm not sure that we actually need to edit the letter on this issue because I have to look back at it, but I think the statement in the letter talks about that there weren't any children in the 6.6 hour studies that were used in the risk analysis. I don't think we stated that there weren't any studies of children. The question will be whether we want to add something about, although there are very limited studies of children, there were none. So we could edit it, there were none of a duration of 6.5 hours. So I'm not, bottom line is I'm not sure we need to edit the letter on that point.
Thank you. I don't personally, I don't think we need to say that in the letter. We acknowledge it here, which is going to be part of our public response. And if there's any place in the consensus responses where we might want to add that, but it seems like it's a minor point for the letter to say that we understand that there are studies on children, if the wording doesn't imply that there's none. So I'm fine with that. Michael. Michael, you're still muted.
There we go. Sorry. Yeah, on line 23, the word those, I think it doesn't relate to anything. I think we're speaking about that 6 to 7 hour exposure studies are used in the risk assessment. So
yeah.
I think just take out the word those, and I think we're good.
Okay. And I swear that was a few too many moving parts last night. I swear that I edited, maybe not, obviously not in this version. We'll make sure that we remove or make clear, because that was brought up maybe by you. And I swear that had been made, but it's not in front of us. So we'll make sure it gets in. Thank you. All right, are we done with 1A then? Let's move to 1B. So this was about the use of the CORIC panel study. And let's start maybe with
Excuse me, Leanne.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was not done with 1A.
Okay, no problem. Go ahead.
So if we just go back, just one comment, and it's only because EPA raised it. They referred to the 1987 study we did looking at children, but did not refer to a 1985 study we published looking at adolescents, 12 to 15-year-olds. Now, in that study, we found that there were changes in lung function, but no according changes in symptoms. And the conclusion from that study was that children may be naive and not be aware and report symptom changes in the face of exposure. And I think that's relevant when they get to this issue about equivalency of children and adults in terms of thinking about how we think about risk.
So that's a good point. And I think I remember you mentioned it. I wasn't sure how to integrate it in this because EPA hadn't mentioned that study. What do you recommend that we do with respect to making sure that gets that point gets made?
Well, I'm not sure how to get that in there. And again, it really speaks to the argument about drawing conclusions about children on the basis of adults.
Okay.
Terry, do you have a suggestion here?
I don't have a suggestion, but I read that. Admitting I'm confused between all the documents, I did read the exact reasoning you just brought up somewhere else.
Yeah, I know Ed added it. I thought it was as a comment or something in an email thread or something. It wasn't a proposed edit in the document. And when I looked at it, I didn't see exactly how to fit it in. That's not that it's not important. So maybe we can figure that out. Maybe Mark, you're going to help us with this.
Well, I was just suggesting in response to Ed's comment, you could add a sentence at the end of the paragraph on line 18 there about the earlier study in the teenagers. You could say that there's also another study in that studied teenagers, and give the reference right there.
All right, that sounds like a good suggestion. Maybe Ed, you could craft something with input from Mark as needed.
So I'll send a sentence in.
And you do have some sentences in attachment A of our clarification request.
Attachment A.
It brings up in young adults, in contrast to young adults, however, they had no symptomatic responses. It actually is missing the AVOL 85 though. It's attachment A, page 7.
Yeah, so that's okay. So that is EPA's request for clarification that they sent on May 18th. And I think that's the point that Ed is making, that EPA didn't refer to that AVOL 85 study. They only referred to the 87 one, and he thought that the 85 study also provided some important evidence. And so the reason that we didn't mention it in our response in 1A, at least previously, was because EPA hadn't mentioned it, and it wasn't easy in the short time we worked on it for me to figure out how to integrate it. But given this conversation, I think we clearly need to add it, so we will. Does that help?
Yes, I think it does. Mark has his hand up, and then actually Catherine appeared and then disappeared with a comment. And given that she also research, I just would include her in the conversation if she so chooses.
Yeah. Oh, Mark, you've disappeared, but Catherine has reappeared with her hand up. So go ahead, Catherine.
Well, it's not brilliant, but I was just saying, I was just thinking about how to get this concept in when we were talking about it. So I sort of agree with Mark's idea of adding to the end of the line that ends in 18 and just could start as a linker. Of note, an additional study involving, CHE study involving, da-da-da-da-da. And you could link it in there. So that's all I had to say.
Okay. We'll make sure it gets in, and if Ed, you want to loop Catherine or Terry or anyone else in, that whatever you draft, you're welcome to, and we'll make sure something gets in. All right, that was helpful, important clarification. Thanks for bringing that up. We are moving. Catherine, your hand is back up, or I'm sorry, I looked away and I saw your. Oh no, okay. So now we're on the CORIC study 1B, and start with what's in front of us, which is lines 39 through 44. Okay, moving on to the rest of the response on the next page. Whatever fits on the screen, the next 2 paragraphs. And we might as well, Aaron, you scroll down to the last 3 lines. Yeah, thank you. And so we provide a pretty strong conclusion that it's an important line of evidence. Okay, I'm not hearing any suggested edits or comments on 1B, so I'm not trying to rush. 1C, this is our response about the Hernandez et al. Study. And so starting on line 38 of page 3, that paragraph goes through line 5 of page 4. And first we acknowledge clarification of the exposure protocol. and state, if Aaron, you want to scroll down a little bit more at the end of that, we state that we consider that exposure protocol to be a strength, not a weakness. And I think that the sentence before, starting on line 2, was edited last night in response to some suggestions by one of us. Maybe it was Ed. So then moving on to line 7, all the way down to line 25.
Leanne, could I break in for a quick second?
Please.
If we could go back to the previous paragraph there.
Sure. The previous paragraph on Hernandez?
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
It's just a typo, I think, but actually maybe even further back. A little bit more. Gosh, where is it? It's something about where the EPA had a question on the response to rapidly changing ozone concentrations. Where is that section?
I think that's in response to the Hernandez study. I think.
Okay, so I think it's
That's
down
line
then.
38 on page 3.
Sorry that it scrolled past, and now I'm trying to find where.
Well, if you think it's just a typo, then we can just do that offline. If you think it changes the meaning, then we should talk about it.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks.
So, so we'll just look for follow-up on typo. All right. So, back to, the first paragraph was about the variable concentration and that we thought it was a strength. The second paragraph, is, and the second paragraph is about its policy relevance, and the fact that it's the only study with prolonged exposures at rest, and we clarify in various ways every time we mention at rest that it's nearly at rest, because not all subjects were completely at rest, and the importance of that. So that's what this paragraph is about. Aaron, you can scroll down a little bit more and see if we can show more of that paragraph. There we go. And on line 17, I know the sample size changed a couple of times in our comments. Just to clarify for people who have also looked at this study, that there were 14 subjects in the FEV1 analysis, and that's why we say 14. It depends, that was actually a secondary analysis, and it depends on the analysis they did, how many subjects they included. Terry.
It's a real small one on line 23, 24. Do we need the sentence studies with a larger number of subjects?
No, we could drop that. I'm fine with dropping that unless anybody objects.
I was just going to say, I agree. I was going to suggest the same. Just for, we had that in, that was in, and then we suggested that the real suggestion is to focus on more studies. That the previous sentence was added to kind of replace the need for larger, because if it actually shows statistical significance, but the sample size wasn't a huge issue.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Speaking as a statistician, the evidence from the study is the evidence, and it shows it. Even if a larger study would give you a more precise estimate, it still shows the results. This study does. So yeah, well, okay, we'll strike the sentence. Thank you to both of you on that. So I'm thinking we'll try to get through the rest of Appendix B and then we'll take a break. So we're ready to move on to number 2, where EPA was focusing on the epi evidence, and they had a couple of specific points. And we made some preliminary comments, which are at the beginning of this section. They go from line 34 down to line 5 on the next page. And I don't know if there's anything more that we want to say, if anybody has any comments or suggested changes. This is a place, and this is something we're going to try to come back to, at least in Appendix C. I note that on line 1, the CASAC thinks that the weight of scientific evidence for respiratory effects from epidemiologic studies is sufficient to argue that a standard in the range of 55 to 60 ppb is appropriate. This is just highlighting that we also heard this from the Earth Justice commenter yesterday, that don't need a risk and exposure assessment to draw important conclusions about the policy relevant exposures that should be addressed for the standard. And we actually made this point, those of you who are on the PM panel, the end of this paragraph talks about that. We actually made that point in the PM review as well. So PM reconsideration. Okay, I'm not seeing any comments, so we'll move on to 2A, which was a discussion about the Strickland study. I don't think I added it, but I was pretty flabbergasted yesterday and the night before when I realized that the Strickland study was actually used for risk assessment in the previous review, with the policy assessment and the HEREA that was published in 2014. So it's kind of interesting that this argument about design values has pretty much struck the evidence now, whereas that argument wasn't used nearly 10 years ago. I don't know that we need to add anything to this, but just editorial comment on that point. All right, the last 2 items, 2B and 3, I guess we can do them in order. 2B is basically, not wanting to be misleading about the current standard. And so this is a place that we need to make sure that we've made the changes in our report. I'm not sure we've caught everything yet. I think Aaron tried to highlight a few places that he thought, without being a scientific expert, that we might want to address this in the report. We will be looking for that, and I welcome everyone helping me find all those places for 2B. And then 3, that's another detail we just need to correct in the report. And we've said we've made the changes, and we just need to make sure that we've got them all. So I think that's it for Appendix B. Anybody else have anything more that you wish to discuss on this appendix, any part of it? Aaron, I think you can stop sharing screen for the moment. Oh, Judy.
Could you move up a little bit, because that Strickland study at the standard level of 91 ppb or above
Yes.
is killed at our ppb. Yeah, 912.
Yeah, what's your question?
No, just remove OR before the ppb. 91.
Oh, that's just a typo. Okay.
Yeah, just minor. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get that. We'll get that done. All right. Anything else? All right, then I'm going to propose that given we've reached a stopping point, we have two more tasks left. We have to discuss our consensus comments on Appendix C, and we have to finish our letter. My proposed order for the meeting was that we would let's see, that we would finish the letter and then work on our rebuttal of the dissenting opinion in Appendix C. So I think we'll stick with that unless anybody has a strong opinion. But in the meantime, I think we all deserve a break. So given that we're further ahead of schedule than I thought, how about we come back at what? We give ourselves 10 minutes. A longer break would be nice. We didn't do that yesterday. All right, see you in 10 minutes. And thank you for your help. All right, welcome back. Hope everyone's back. I realized that before the break, I overlooked that there were a few things we should return to in the consensus comments. And while we were on the break, I tried to identify what I thought we needed to talk about. And I think there's not that much. I think I added a paragraph that was from my individual comments and that I deleted from Appendix B because it wasn't really relevant to our response to EPA. It was a summary paragraph that was at the end of the primary standard section, and I put that in our consensus comments. So if Aaron, if you can share that document, it's on page 9 of the document, right below the figures from Hernandez et al. And for members of the public and others who don't have this in front of you, we're talking about inserting the paragraph on our consensus comments, page 9, after line 18 is where it would go. All right, so there you go, Aaron, you're right there. So this, with minor edits, thank you, Aaron. This is the paragraph that was already and is already in my individual comments, so people have had a chance to read it. And it was basically, it's an overall summary of our thoughts about how we responded to the request for clarification. And we're using the word inappropriately here. So that's, but again, that's about the way the evidence is used, the way the science is used, not about an individual. So, but we can talk about that. So I open up discussion of this paragraph and whether it should be added and any other comments people have. Catherine.
There's something about this line 31 where it says, thus the assumption that people with asthma, wait, I have this right. Oh no, the line 27, thus the exposure.
Yeah, why, Aaron, why does your version have a different page numbers than ours?
It reads strangely to me because you're talking about you start out in concluding that the FEV1 decrements observed is within a range of variability and thus does not need to be included. It seems like instead of saying thus, it says, you want to say the exposure, yet the exposure assessment, requires, or something like that. It didn't link well to me to say thus. It's because. Okay. So thinking about, maybe something like, yet the exposure assessment requires that kids be exercising for 7 hours would make more sense.
Are you talking about line 27 or line 31?
Line 27.
Ah, okay.
And I'm thinking just replacing thus with yet makes more sense.
Okay, the thus, this, and at the beginning of the sentence.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay. Ed, you have your hand up.
Yes, in line 23, I would suggest replacing in the latter half of that sentence where it says put inappropriate emphasis. I would exchange inappropriate for undue.
Undue. The version I have and the version that Aaron is showing have different line numbers, so I'm trying to process where this is.
Says by conditioning its review on the current standard and its peak form, EPA.
Oh, inappropriate. Okay, so change that to an undue. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. That's the word. Thank you, Aaron. Any other, it sounds like people are happy to put this summary in the consensus comments. Mark.
Yes, let's see now, in the one sentence, beginning line 22 says, by conditioning its review on the current standard and its peak-based form. That sentence gives me a little pause. I'm not quite sure what it means. In terms of its review, we're talking about the ISA, right?
No, I think we're talking about its policy assessment review. And, the peak-based form of the current standard was the justification for not using any of the epidemiology in a risk or exposure assessment, even though that was done in 2014. So that's the idea behind the wording.
Oh, okay. So maybe that needs to be reworded because I wasn't quite clear what it meant. And we do state that elsewhere. So in other words, this is our argument that EPA's argument was that the EPI studies were inappropriate to use because the area being studied was not in compliance with the current standard. And that current standard has a peak-based form.
Yes.
I think we need to reword that part of the sentence.
Okay.
Yeah, because
wordsmith it here, but we can flag it.
Yeah, I don't know how to change it, quite frankly, but that sentence is throwing me off a bit.
Okay, appreciate that. Jeremy, are you going to solve our problem?
No, I definitely am not, but hopefully I won't make the problem worse, but we'll see. No, but it actually is kind of a little bit related to what Mark was saying, that I kind of feel like not just here, but here as well, there's a slight dissonance in terms of what we're saying about what EPA staff has done. Like on the one hand, we're saying that they have not considered the EPI evidence, right? Which I don't think is true. I think what they've done is they have constrained the evidence around this form, right? So I don't know if that, and that's sort of related to what Mark is getting at here. It's not that EPA hasn't considered the EPI evidence. It's just that they've felt that it wasn't relevant, policy relevant, given the form and the standard. So I don't know if that requires us kind of going back to some previous statements about the consideration of the EPI lines of evidence, but I don't think that I would want to really say that EPA has not considered the EPI evidence.
No, you're absolutely right. We don't want to say that because you're absolutely right. They did. And we should make sure that we're not ever saying they didn't consider it. You're absolutely right. They did consider it. It's just wasn't taken forward in a way that was used in a risk assessment and not given the weight that we thought it deserved.
And I could try to go back and look. I should have opened my mouth earlier, but yeah.
No, that's an important point, and we should make sure that if that crops up elsewhere, that we've addressed that so that we're clear. That's a really important point. And Mark, you were going to further comment?
Yeah, I took my hand down because I agree with that. Yeah, we shouldn't say it wasn't considered. It was considered and excluded from the risk assessment.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll make sure to make you edits. we can do it in real time if it's easy. Otherwise, we'll do it. We've stated our intent, so we can get the details of the wording clarified offline. Further comments on this added paragraph? Aaron, do you want to scroll down a little bit in case people are just looking at what's in front of them? There you go. That's plenty. It's just the red. All right. I think then if not, we can move on to Jim's edits of his dissenting opinion. And I think consistent with the discussion we had in the secondary standard, I would ask that this one sentence in the consensus comments be shorter than what it is, and addressing the key broad point with as it already refers to Appendix C for the details.
Yes, and I've already sent in to you and Aaron a new sentence that does that.
All right, thank you. Appreciate that. I think that's the only part of the consensus comments we need to revisit. Does anybody want to look at anything else? Did you see anything else in these track changes version that you think bears discussion? Because if not, then we will now turn to the letter, the rest of the letter. The parts that we didn't do this morning. Okay, so Aaron, you can stop sharing this document. Sounds like no, but I'm not seeing anybody asking for attention to any other parts of it. And let's share. Oh yeah, I guess we may want to look at the track changes version, just cross-reference with the May 2nd public version of the letter. So we're on page L1. And all of that page, we already got a sentence from Judy that will be added on line 41 after the opening sentence. We already talked about that. So I don't think we need to revisit that. Let's move on to yeah, so I guess it would be starting on the paragraph that starts on line 4 and goes to line 23 in the public version. And here there are some proposed edits, and Mark, these are this is a track change version of your public comments. Hopefully we got the most recent version of them. It's possible it was an older version. So did you want to summarize anything on our behalf of these proposed edits?
I'm just reading them through to try to remember. But no, I think people should make sure they're comfortable with them. Let's just see here what the comments are. Yeah, no, they're just mostly kind of a little bit editorial and wording things, but I'll need to read it again myself.
Yeah, and if for whatever reason you made minor edits to the version that's here, we'll get those incorporated and just let us know. Does anybody need more time with this paragraph? Jeremy?
So this, I guess, would be an example of maybe language that we want to avoid if we look at lines 9 and 10. So EPA presents rationale for relying on CHE data, but failure to consider the epidemiological data in assessing adequacy is concerning. I don't think they failed to consider the epi data.
Yeah, Well, they only failed to consider it in the risk assessment, right? I mean, that's the point we were just making in your, when you
Right. Oh,
brought this
yeah,
up
right. Oh,
earlier.
I see what you're saying. Right. Yeah.
So,
Right.
so this needs to be edited. You're right, because your point is well taken. And this is a good example of where we need to edit it. So,
Can you just add a sentence? In the risk assessment?
yeah,
Yeah.
that's an easy short-term fix. Well, we should consider whether there's other, given the, whether we want to say anything about the constrained consideration, but I think failure in the risk assessment does address it also. Mark.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I entirely agree. I mean, that is true that they didn't include it in the risk assessment, but it's also true that they didn't include it in consideration of the standard. I think what's stated here is true. And that's the larger concern. I mean, maybe, we're not providing any specific advice about how to do a risk assessment using the EPI data. And EPA has told us that that's a real challenge for them. And that's part of the reason they haven't done it, is they haven't, they're not sure how to do it, I think.
Yeah, can I stop you right there, Mark, just for a second, just to insert that they did do it in 2014. So
yes.
I don't understand that they now don't know how to do it, but
okay. Yeah.
That's just wanting to get that out there. I don't know that we need to belabor that in writing, but it is some cognitive dissonance in another way. So sorry.
Yeah, no, your point's well taken, but my point is that it's not just the risk assessment, that even if they don't do a risk assessment based on the EPI data, it still needs to be considered in assessing the adequacy of the standard. And I think that's the point here. And I think it's, I don't think we need to necessarily change that.
Okay, thank you. That's another good perspective. And we need to somehow hold both what Jeremy's saying and what you're saying and figure out how to navigate. Ed, are you going to help us with that?
Well, I don't know, or maybe muddy the waters. Would it help to think about it in terms of they undervalued the EPI studies rather than there was just a failure to even consider it?
This is Michelle. I like that language. Or did not fully consider.
Yeah, or you could say, not, rather than failure to consider, failure to include. Because they did, as we said before, they did consider it and decided not to include it in assessing the adequacy of the standard. So that would maybe better reflect it.
Okay. Do we have clarity on what we're going to put?
I think Mark's language, changing it to failure to include, really is truthful and covers concern.
And it's failing to include in the, so it was considered failing to include and it's just part of the sentence, in assessing the adequacy of the standard. Because we're arguing here in this statement that in failing to include it, basically all the weight was given on the controlled human exposure studies, and therefore the standard was considered adequate. Is how one would take that sentence to what its implications are. Okay. Is that? So. All right, anything, Terry?
Yeah, line 25. I like the thrust of that, but I guess it's the word directly that you have in there. Should not be used directly. Is that clear enough?
So are you suggesting dropping it?
No, I'm not sure what to suggest. I just think that if the EPA's decision was to not use EPI, if there were no children in the reviewed CHE studies, then we're saying we can't use the risk estimation for children at all. It just bugs me that directly. I'm okay with it. It just
Be used solely.
I just wanted to bring it up, but so I'm okay.
Mark.
Yeah, this is Mark Frampton. I struggled with that a little bit as our group was drafting this section. To me, it means the word is in there because you could envision that you could envision some kind of correction factor, or not a correction factor, but a safety margin when trying to extrapolate the studies in adults to studies in children. There are other ways to think about it in the risk estimation that we didn't want to completely exclude here. But the word directly is meant to mean that you shouldn't be taking the actual exposure threshold in adults where you see no effect and applying that directly to children. So that's the intent here. Maybe we need some additional words to make that clear.
George.
Maybe should not be used solely in risk estimation.
No, I mean, directly, I agree with everything Mark said for the reasons he said them. So then I'm pretty okay with directly, unless we come up with a better word.
Okay.
Well, maybe what we need to do is put the modifier that Mark suggested after risk estimation for children without also applying some correction factor or mitigation factor to account for the data limitations.
Yeah, Mike, I would not want to go over that bridge. To me, that invites, I'm not advocating doing that by any means. And I think a lot of people would have trouble doing that. So I'd prefer not to even mention it.
So it sounds like we're converging on leaving it as is.
Yes.
Good discussion. Converging on leaving it as is. Okay. Let's move on. Lines 25 to 27. We're agreeing with retaining the ozone indicator. So I guess there's not much to discuss there. Next up is the paragraph that starts in the May 2nd document on line 29, and Aaron has in front of us. Ends on L3 line 2. And that's stating our conclusion. Aaron has highlighted in yellow a place where where the 70 needs to be changed to 73 ppb. And again, welcome experts on where the 70 is appropriate as opposed to the 73. The standard is at 70, so that the previous sentence isn't flagged. And folks from EPA, welcome to chime in here to make us, to help us get it right. If you see places where we should be changing 70 to 73 and we've missed them, I strongly encourage you to tell us that now or during this public meeting. Mark.
Yes, just I have a little bit of trouble with line 41, where adverse effects would be expected to be greater. I'm not in terms of the human studies, I don't think we have a basis to expect that. Because as EPA has pointed out, and as we concur, these very limited studies in children have not suggested greater lung function changes than in the healthy adults. So I don't know what will be the outcome of 6 to 7 hour studies in children. They might end up having the same kind of decrement as adults. They might not. I'm not sure they would be expected to be greater. I guess I'd like to drop that part of the phrase.
Okay. All right. So we can drop that unless somebody objects or wants to change the language. Jennifer.
I don't want to object or change the language to that one. Going back to the 70 versus 73 statement that's highlighted in yellow.
Yeah.
I suggest to make sure that that's accurate and specific, that we add in the references that we're talking about. It seems to be referring to the adult studies that had 6.6 hours of exposure.
Yeah, it's basically a single study, so we should provide that reference.
That was Schlegel, right?
Either Schlegel or it wasn't Kim, was it?
No, Kim was the 60.
Okay.
George, did you want to say something more?
Yeah, going back to the pink highlight, 6 to 7 hour CHE studies, which it's true, as Mark pointed out, the children part doesn't apply, but for people with asthma, I think, and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, where adverse effects would be expected to be greater for asthmatics, is there a way to leave that part in?
So just leave it in as is. I mean, I think, so as it is, it says all these studies were performed in healthy adults, and there's no studies in children or people with asthma. I got you. So where adverse effects would be expected to be greater, the trouble is that in either children, I mean, there are studies of people with asthma, and most of them don't suggest that there are greater effects on lung function. Now, maybe this sentence is not just talking about lung function. So if we're talking about other effects in people with asthma, then there might be greater adverse effects, but it's just kind of muddy, I think, the way it's stated. And
I agree. It needs to be cleaned up. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think it'd be cleaner just to drop that phrase.
Okay. All right. That's okay.
Okay. Yeah, so one could, with an additional comma, one could probably connect it better to the people with asthma, but it sounds like it's better to drop it. Oh, Christina.
Yeah, so I just wanted to push back a little bit on that because, children, people with asthma are considered at-risk populations, and they're at risk because there's an expectation that they're going to be more affected than the general population. So it seems accurate to say that the effects may be expected to be greater, even though with this, particular studies, you find out for those if they are or not, but otherwise they wouldn't be identified as being at risk. There must be some kind of innate or external vulnerability, which is why they're put into that category. So I just think that this is pretty accurate how it is.
Well, maybe would it be helpful to say something more along the lines of what you're headed at, which is not about the adverse effects that one might observe in the controlled human exposure studies, but that they, that they're that they're members of susceptible subpopulations, and just leave it at that, because that's why we're worried about those populations, is because in general, they may have bigger impacts. But I think what I heard as the concern with this sentence is that we're implying that a controlled human exposure study would see greater effects in one or both of these populations. And I don't think there's any disagreement about your susceptibility point. Mark, did you want to help us?
No, I agree, Leanne, with your comments. I do think as the paragraph goes on, we make that point that, it talks about the CORIC study, in which suggests that in the real world, in an observational study, the people with asthma may have bigger responses. And then the epi data is what's really convincing that children with asthma are at risk here. So that sentence that we're talking about is just talking about these 6.6 hour pulmonary function and airway inflammation results. And it's kind of a technical point, but there's no reason, based on the data that's out there, I don't think we know what the results would be of a controlled chamber exposure in children or in asthmatics with these prolonged exposure studies. But I think the rest of the paragraph adequately makes the point that, these are susceptible groups, but not because of the data from the human studies.
Okay, thank you. So that suggests we could continue to leave that clause struck. Catherine, are you going to help us with this more?
Just in the spirit of wordsmithing, I'm wondering if I agree with the sentiments others have noted, but I'm thinking if you say there are no comparable 6 to 7 hour CH studies which evaluated kids or people with asthma, period. And that sets you up for, now we're talking about, these are not exactly comparable studies, but here's this other lines of evidence. So again, it's just a wordsmithing thing, but I think if you change the sentence, all these studies are performed in healthy adults and there are no comparable 6 to 7 hour CHE studies which evaluated kids or people with asthma, stop. And then the stuff that comes next kind of clarifies that we are concerned about these other lines of evidence that would suggest their vulnerability.
Sounds good to me.
That's good. And it also indirectly alludes to the fact that there is some evidence in children, but it's not comparable. Yeah. Okay, we'll make that change. Thank you. So I note in this paragraph, there's my highlighting that Ed Aval had suggested reversing the order of the 2 sentences, one of which that we were talking about. I guess, though, if we strike the adverse effects part, we maybe don't need to reverse the order of the sentences. I'm wondering if Ed and or Mark want to weigh in on that, because this is starting out talking about controlled human exposure studies, mentioning the Hernandez study as well. Again, a comment about the controlled human exposure studies, and then switches gears to panel studies and epidemiologic studies. So maybe don't need to switch the order of those sentences, particularly with that that clause struck.
I'm fine with that. I just thought that the flow of it was, there was a logical, I mean, it seemed like the evidence was not provided, the transition was not made, but I'm fine with it, with the corrections that have been discussed.
Okay. Okay, we'll drop that suggestion then. All right, so we're ready to move on to the sentence that is on, starts on line 29 of, is that right? No, wait a minute. We're now on L3, line 4 to 10. All of the CASAC members recommend a level. And so that paragraph, and it's in front of you, lines 8 through 14. Catherine.
I have one more comment for line 5, 6. I would suggest that after the last word, parts per billion, we add in a linear dose response fashion.
Okay, so that's on the previous paragraph.
Correct.
And maybe we can say concentration response though, right?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I think that's a important concept, especially when you're giving that range.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that same sentence. So they show increases in asthma ED visits associated with ozone exposure concentrations between 45 and 65. It actually, from the exposure response curve, there are associations 45 and higher. It actually goes above 65. I think what we were trying to say there, or maybe wherever this sentence came from, was the preponderance of the data are between 45 and 65.
I think you're right. So maybe we just edit it to say something to the effect where the bulk of the data with the majority of the ozone exposure concentrations.
And I don't know if it's majority.
Okay.
I don't, that would be hard to quantify specifically.
That's true. Maybe a large proportion or something, not so specific.
What if you just said what Jennifer said, that associated with the linear dose response between 45 and 65?
Well, the sentence actually should increases associated with exposure concentrations. Okay, yeah, maybe I wasn't reading the whole sentence.
Yeah, I think the point is there are associations observed in a linear dose response fashion below the current standard. And it's also where the bulk of the data are between 45 and 65, or a preponderance of data. So I guess there are 2 points here. One, we do observe increased associations below the current standard, and then that observation is not based on just a few data points. I think are the 2 important points there.
Right, that's right. Aaron.
So this one was highlighted because from the request for clarifications from EPA, they had indicated the comparison of epi data with the current standard. And the response proposed by the committee was that you would make these changes. So this was highlighting one of those areas where there was a comparison between the epi data and the level of the current standard.
Yeah, so maybe what we should do, thank you for reminding us of that. Maybe what we should do is at least add a sentence that acknowledges that distinction. Right, and Jennifer, it looks like you're agreeing.
Yeah, because I actually, it would be, yes, I think that's the main point, where maybe we can nuance that wording so that we're not saying, maybe we could just say below 70.
Yeah, but I think it's still true, whatever. I mean, it's still true that the standard is a different animal than those values in that study. I mean, that's just true of all the epi studies.
Yeah, so we could just acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think that's what we probably need to do. Catherine.
Thinking again about sort of editing this sentence, what about something that says shows increased concentration response demonstrated at levels above 45 parts per billion with the most precision in the range of 45 to 65 parts per billion, something like that. To
increased compared with what?
I'm sorry, to say increased shows increasing concentration response or something.
Oh, okay.
Or just say shows. Yeah, it shows a linear concentration response demonstrating at levels above 45 with the most precision between 45 and 65 parts per billion.
Okay, yeah, so we'll wordsmith that sentence and maybe run it by some people, and we're going to add a sentence too that addresses this misalignment between the standard and the values in the epi studies. Mark.
Yeah, just on that very sentence that you're going to add. I guess
you're
I'm
going to
not
write it.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely, because I don't know the answer to that. So in terms of, so is EPA saying, is the intent here is that because the form of the standard is different than the averaging time in these epi studies that we can't compare them? And I don't get that. I think it's pretty, to me, it's pretty obvious that, if you got a lot of data between 45 and 65, and you have a standard of 70, that you're going to have some days, if you're meeting this, even if you're meeting the standard, you're still going to have a lot of days in that 45 to 65. And the EPA, in their request for more information, provided us with that graph that showed that when you did reduce the middle of the distribution when in the later years in Atlanta, when they met compliance with the standard, but still in that changed lower distribution, it was a lot of exposure days in that mid-range of 45 to 65, meaning that, yeah, there's still a lot of exposures going on in that range. So I guess, so what we're saying we're going to do in that sentence is saying we acknowledge that that we can't compare the data directly. However, and maybe even reference the graph that they point out that even when the area meets the standard, there are still substantial exposure days and likely hospitalizations and the ED visits at levels in a situation where the standard is being met.
Yeah, so that's helpful comment. And I'm going to invite EPA, since they requested the clarification, to weigh in on this and help us.
Oh, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Okay, let's get the camera here. Hold on. Oh, no, hold on.
You're still there, or we're still hearing you.
We have a poor video set up. We apologize.
Okay, well, yesterday it worked with one of you on your laptops, just turning that video on without the sound.
There. Is this better? There we are.
I'm not seeing you. I'm hearing you.
Okay. So I think we were looking first of all for clarification about what your question is for us, and then we will do our best to answer it.
Well, I think our question is more connected with your request for clarification, where you noted that when we quote the levels of the EPI studies, that they're not necessarily lined up with the standard at all, and you provided quite a bit of detail in your request for clarification, Appendix B, and then we basically are saying, okay, well, that's right, we agree with you, and so I guess what is it that would be, we can acknowledge that, for instance, in the text we're talking about, that what we're quoting in the EPI evidence is not directly comparable to the standard. But I guess it would be useful to know what would be helpful to you, because as Mark said, there's still a lot of days where people are being exposed to levels where there's impacts. So we can just add a sentence that addresses your concern and that we understand there's a difference. But we still think that the EPI evidence, by showing there is a bunch of days in the range of the level that we're recommending, suggests the standard needs to be lower, is my understanding of where we are. And so what else would it be helpful for us to say that would make things as clear as possible and as useful as possible to EPA?
So this is Deirdre Murphy. I think you still can't see us, huh? Sorry. But so I'll say there's sort of two aspects to that. One is that the way you just cited that there are still days with a value of 70 as an 8-hour daily max. Well, that is, the point is that an 8-hour daily max, that's 70. So implying that simply means the standard is not adequate is an apples to oranges statement, because the 70 in terms of the standard level is a different metric. And comparing simple 8-hour daily maxes to 70 and implying you're comparing it to the standard is an inaccuracy. So that's one point which we tried to make clear in the study, that those in our the letter that Erica sent. The second thing is, as Dr. Frampton said, you can see from the graphs we provided that you do have 8-hour daily maxes in the range. They're much lower when you meet the standard. The 75th percentile for the 8-hour daily maxes in Atlanta are about maybe 50 for this, or less than 50 for the 75th percentile. There are, if you go up to the extremes, some that are 60, 80. I think the maximum value that was seen was 90 or something. But we can't say what that means in terms of an EPI study, because we don't have an EPI study that was conducted with that air quality. So we don't have people that were exposed to that air quality and we assessed the health outcomes of those people. We have a hypothesis that if that study were available, what we might see, and various of the panel members have expressed their hypothesis, but we don't have that evidence base. So I think those are the 2 points that I think we're trying to make.
Yeah, so maybe we can have a little bit further discussion, because in the policy assessment in 2014, you did all these cutoff analyses, which in some sense address the fact that, yeah, the epi studies had a bunch of days that were above, but you could reduce you could look at just the subset of days and see whether the epi evidence still held up, that there's this increased risk. That was in the policy assessment. You did that cutoff analysis.
So there were a couple of different analyses done in the policy assessment, and they were concluded to have a relatively greater uncertainty than other aspects of the information available for the decision making. And that specifically was discussed in the proposal and final rulemaking notices, where the agency and the administrator described which aspects of the information available she had greater, it was Gina McCarthy, she had greater confidence in, and that was not one, because of the things that I just described. It's manipulating a data set, not looking at the effects observed in a population of people when they were exposed to a certain pattern of air quality.
I mean, take that to the logical conclusion. It seems to me that you can't ever do such an analysis when you have areas that are outside the standard. You can never conclude anything about the adequacy of the standard when you're above it.
Well, if there is not a study that demonstrates something, we have to rely on the other. I'm not sure following.
Yeah, I think, Leanne, this is Erica. I think this is one of our fundamental points, is that at least in the past, we have pretty consistently said that if we have no observational data at levels below the standard, it becomes much more difficult for us to say that the standard is not requisite. We want to see that the health effects persist even when meeting the current standard. That for us is a clear indication that the standard is not adequate. And in this case, we don't have that. And so we are trying to put together the story with the evidence that we do have. And unfortunately, it all circles around the level of the current standard or above.
For the epidemiological evidence.
Yeah. Well, even the controlled human exposure data, we have a limited number of studies, very few of which are at or below the level of the standard. And so that's another area where we would like to see more.
Right. We would like to see more, but we use those to estimate exposures that people might have to those concentrations.
Right.
That's the use of the exposure.
Yeah, that seems to be yeah, I hear you. I think a lot of us don't feel like that's a good enough argument. I don't know how else to say it. Mark, maybe you will help with this.
Oh, probably not, but yeah, this is a very useful discussion, and it really comes down to the crux of our arguments here. And I'm very simple-minded, and so to me, looking, for example, at the Strickland study, recognizing that these were 3-day averages, and the area did not meet the standard at the time that this study was done. But if you show that you have a lot of adverse health effects going on in this, where the bulk of the data were, 45 to 65 ppb, and even later on when the area was just in compliance with the standard, you show that the mid-range, there's still a lot of mid-range exposures in that range going on there. Yes, there are fewer of them, and that's good. One would expect to see fewer health effects as well, but there's still a lot of exposures going on in that range. And it makes, and so you have that dose response curve that tells you there's still going to be a lot of hospital admissions and asthma attacks going on days, sequences of days at least, where those kind of exposure concentrations are happening. And so to me, yeah, we don't have the study to prove that, but to me, it's a logical conclusion based on the data that we're looking at. So I'm having trouble understanding how you cannot consider that.
Thank you, Mark. That's very helpful. And if EPA wants to continue to help us think about this, I really appreciate it.
If I could just, yeah, this is Karen Wesson. I think Dr. Frampton, you make, a good points. And so if you think about the epidemiological evidence and you think about it potentially demonstrating exposures at which you would like to have a standard that protects you from, I think that, that's not an inappropriate way to look at it. And so if you're looking at these epi studies and saying like these, based on the metric in the study, based on the concentrations that we think are associated with effects, we are looking at a standard level that will protect against these types of exposures. Again, I think that that's not an inappropriate way to look at it. I think then the extension needs to be, okay, well, what standard level would we need to be at in the US to provide that type of protection? So for example, if you say, I think that we need to avoid typical exposures of 50 ppb, then the extension of that is what peak ozone standard, fourth high, would we set to minimize those types of exposures across the US? So that's the extension of the thought process. I think that's kind of missing.
Yes, that's exactly right, and obviously that's what your risk assessment attempts to help with. And I think our whole argument is that, without a detailed risk assessment, it's difficult to. Obviously, the whole standard setting process, the lower your range, the more uncertainty there's going to be in the health effects. And at some point, you have to do an estimate of what you think is going to be adequately protective with a margin of safety. And that's how we, in my understanding, that's how we kind of arrived at 55 to 60, is kind of trying to balance the uncertainty the lower we go with the data that's out there in the epi studies. And to me, that's what drives this consideration. But the goal is exactly what you're saying. We want to set a standard that's going to protect from the majority of the exposures of concern. And those exposures of concern are, in this 50 ppb range. So that's kind of what led us to a 55 to 60.
Thank you. That's very helpful articulation. Jeremy.
Yeah, and I think that's right, and that's why I kind of have struggled throughout this process with like this idea about the form itself of the standard and how ultimately I think that's the hardest piece right now, and whether or not the form is adequate is adequate in protecting health. But I think in the interim, and this is where I think that this current PA really fails is that it's too kind of black and white in terms of designating, what gets considered and what doesn't. I mean, given the fact that there is all of this uncertainty, like in the study findings themselves, in the selection of the form itself. I wish that there would have been a way to incorporate sensitivity around the fact that there is this uncertainty. So, what I mean is, what if you kind of did just as an experiment, kind of play around with different expressions or of the form itself and see how that could have potentially affected, which epi studies, might be considered, and that wasn't done. So a sensitivity analysis that takes into account the considerable uncertainty, especially at these exposures, this range of exposures, that's what I think is missing ultimately. But I mean, the bigger question is the one about the standard itself and the form of the standard itself. But for now, I think more sensitivity analysis around, what has been done would have been helpful. That's my comment is like I don't know what to do with it, but yeah.
Well, I appreciate you airing it. Jim.
Yeah, I think so. This discussion sort of ties in with my dissenting opinion. And I think the point is, I think we all would have liked to have seen an REA based on the epi studies and see what it would have shown. And I guess without that piece of it, we don't know if the standard of 70 protects against the concentrations we think it needs to protect against. Without that's the thing that ties the two things together. And without it, it's hard to judge, what level of the standard needs to be. And based on what's in front, it's just hard to assume that if it had been done, it would have not shown this current standard to be adequate. That would just be kind of guessing at what an outcome would have been if an analysis had been done. And that's really the crux of my comments that we'll talk about later. So
Yeah, well, thank you, Jim. And I think the rest of us have concluded that we all agree. I think we're unanimous. We would have liked to have seen a risk and exposure assessment with the EPI study. And as Jeremy said, it could have gone much deeper than anything that's been done before by looking at many different options that wouldn't have constrained it to the current design values and so on. But that said, I think, and we've provided the arguments in our report, the scientific evidence is compelling that that the standard should be lowered. I think that we, except for you, Jim, because of the lack of the risk and exposure assessment, I think we have reached that conclusion and we have provided the justification for that in our report. And I think that Mark is right that it is hard to know what that range should be, because we don't have the information we would like. But we're still convinced that the standard should be in the range that we're recommending because of the compelling scientific evidence that comes not only from the controlled human exposure studies, but also from the EPI studies. Jeremy, did you want to?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with your synopsis, Leanne, and actually Jim too. I agree with what you just said. And to Erica's point about this process of assigning design values to the EPI studies, I'm not even opposed to. I think that's appropriate, but I would have liked to have seen a little bit more sensitivity around that process to potentially see how this process kind of excluded specific studies. That's all I'm saying about that. So I appreciate what went into trying to consider policy relevant EPI studies in the distributions, but it just was too black and white for me.
So I'm wondering how we addressed getting back to the letter, and I think we've agreed that we need to add some sort of a sentence, and it also strikes me as that somehow we need to address this fuller conversation. I'm not sure how we do it in the time frame that we have right now.
Can I just suggest that I think it may be reflected in the individual comments. I think I made some reference to it. Can we just kind of refer to individual comments?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much we want to do that in the letter.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
But we could certainly do some of that, and this is a synopsis of what we wrote in our consensus comments. So I think at a minimum, we're going to, we'll edit the sentence as was suggested, and we will add some acknowledgement that those values that are alluding to that EPA's request for clarification are not the same thing as values, the design values. And I'm not sure what else to do, given we've only got an hour left to figure this out. If we are able offline to craft a summary of what we've talked about in the past 10-15 minutes, I think that would be valuable. Not quite sure how to navigate it, though. Jennifer.
One thing we might want to consider is looking at the figures 1 and 2 that were sent to us in the EPA request for clarification. They were figures 1 and 2 from the policy assessment, I believe, that they recopied for that request, showing if the design value, we've referenced these figures before, when the design value is 65, 70, 75 in Atlanta, where you see the 8-hour max, the distribution of the 8-hour max values. I mean, so then we can say when we see those 8-hour max values that are predicted, we see from the Strickland et al. Study that we would expect to see adverse health effects on those days.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I may ask you to help us with writing that.
As long as that is coherent and makes sense to folks.
I think you're right, though, that referencing those figures is probably helpful, and this document's going to be in our report. So, okay, are we able to move on? Now I'm starting to worry about time again. So we are, in front of us is all the CASAC members except for one on, it was letter page 3, May 2nd version, lines 4 through 10. All right, assuming no changes to that, moving on to the dissent, Jim's already updated that, so I don't think we need to talk about it. And then the CASAC unanimously recommends, that's lines 23 through 26 on L3 of the May 2nd version. And I think we've discussed the first part of it at some length just now. All right, Terry.
Just a quick one. Someone suggested line 43, include studies? There was a modifier on studies someone suggested, like high quality or something someone said.
Yeah, that was me.
I thought we decided not to put that in.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think the point is that all the other criteria would still hold. It's just opening up the criteria of location, geographic location.
Yeah, I mean, if we need a clarification,
It's fine then. We decided.
It's good.
all right, thanks. So now the rest of this is the chapter 4, which we discussed earlier today. So I'm going to ask that we move down to L5. L5, line in the May 2nd version, it's line 20. It starts with in summary. So this is sort of a broad summary statement about EPA's conclusions, about the effectiveness of the standards, and so on. George.
I would suggest on line, I'm not sure where it is here, but line 30 through 32 on the older version.
Okay.
The sentence, these CASAC members do not agree with the use of median RBL values. All of line 31, which is not line 31 here, it's in the middle of the paragraph. Regarding.
It starts regarding secondary standard.
Yes, to delete the do not agree, blah, 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 because it's repetitive down below. That is covered quite thoroughly. So delete do not agree with the use of median RBL values to determine if protective is the current standard, and then start with, and the CASAC members find that recent scientific evidence, because it's really repetitive and it's thoroughly covered in the next few lines below.
Okay. Okay, we'll delete. Okay, anything else on this paragraph, summary paragraph? All right, then the last paragraph on L6 on the May 2nd version, lines 1 through 14. There were some proposed edits by Ed Aval. And Aaron, you can move down a little bit. This paragraph, we return to a little bit more of a process summary and highlight the value of the in-person meetings, which I thought was tremendously more productive than working on Zoom. And also restating our advice about the value of having a big panel. And I can't tell you all how much I have valued all of your multiple perspectives in these conversations. I don't think that any 7 of us, including the 7 of us that are currently on the Charter CASAC, could do the job that we have done together with all these other voices. So I wanted to express my appreciation for that. And this is just a rewording of something that we had lifted from previous advice, I think on our when we did the PM reconsideration. And so it's just I thought Ed worded it better than we had worded it originally. So I was recommending we change that. Jim.
Yeah, and I thought we changed this on the PM one. The word perspectives, I thought we had changed to knowledge or expertise or something.
Okay.
and I think we had changed that on the PM one, and I would propose to use a different word than perspective.
Okay,
Okay,
that's fine. Yeah, because perspective does sound maybe less scientific than we're headed for.
And does anybody have any suggestions for another word?
Expertise.
Yeah, something like that would be good.
This is Michelle. I also prefer expertise to perspectives, or expertise, and yeah, expertise is good.
Okay. We'll do that. Thank you. Christina.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. Is it possible to include perspectives and expertise? Because you may have the same expertise, but then have different perspectives upon how you interpret some of the science.
I can imagine
This is
that would make.
Michelle. Sorry, I'll put my video on. I'm having video trouble. Is it working? I think you're clearly right, Christina, that people can have different perspectives with the same expertise. But relating to some comments that were made yesterday, we weren't selected for our perspectives. We were selected for our expertise. And I don't think it's implied that everyone with the same expertise will have the same perspectives. So I think expertise is a better place to stop. It's my opinion.
Thank you. Terry, you were going to make a comment on this too.
I was going to say the exact same thing. It'd be hard for SAB to pick people on perspectives.
Okay. And yeah, the multiple experts, that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to have multiple experts, because even if we're expert in the same area, we do bring a different lens by virtue of the science we've looked at in greater depth and all kinds of other things. So is that okay, Christina?
Yeah, that I'm good with that. Although I prefer to have both, but I'm good with that because I understand, and I think it's maybe more clear for most people to be able to understand that. So it's fine.
Thank you. Okay, are we done with the letter, Aaron?
So I just wanted to get clarification as to who was editing that statement regarding the comparison of EPI data with the current standard.
Let's see. I imagine I'm going to have to be involved. Jennifer, I was hoping you would contribute. Do we want to ask for a couple other people? Maybe Mark and Jeremy, you both spoke up. Would that be a good group for that?
I shouldn't have spoke up, but I'll do it since I did.
Okay, so then I wanted to point out, because we didn't go through it, there were some additional portions within the consensus response that were highlighted.
Oh, thank you.
So just to raise, when you're going through to clarify those statements, to also make sure you get those as well. So this bullet here, and again, it's highlighted in the track changes version you have. So, and then there's one more portion, I think.
And thank you, Aaron, for going through and looking for these things. Okay, so we will try to make sure we get those addressed throughout the document. This is a hard one because and it was really valuable to hear from EPA. I think it's hard for us all to completely think about how to address it, but it gets down to some of the points that were made about where the evidence is and how we want to think about it. And I think we're going to end up, at least from what I've heard today, CASAC just has a different take on it than the EPA staff and their writing of the policy assessment. All right, we have one task left and a little under an hour. If we can turn now to the Appendix C draft. And there were two pieces to it. There was Jim's proposed dissenting opinion. And then there is, which I want to talk about briefly, and then there is our consensus rebuttal, which we need to reach consensus on. And Jim, I would ask that this got longer than it was before. And I would ask that we try to keep the dissent in the spirit of the versions we've seen in SAB before. CASAC doesn't have a policy on this yet. As you know, we just decided to adopt one in the spirit of the SAB policy. I mean, the dissent examples that we see, I think we're all a page. And the National Academy of Sciences dissent that we looked at was also not that long. I'm not remembering the details. It had a rebuttal. The SAB ones didn't. I'm suggesting we do have a rebuttal, particularly since we had text in our document that we've taken out that belongs in the rebuttal. But Jim, I think there's a place for your dissent to be shorter and more concise with any additional details in your individual comments, as is our normal practice. There is no restriction in what we put in our individual comments, and we are free to refer to them when we need to for additional details. Personally, I think this dissent is too long. It's 5 pages. Maybe that is including some text that I shouldn't be counting, but still 4 pages.
So I was told yesterday that my dissent in the appendix could be as long as I wanted it to be. So
Yeah, and we're all navigating. So, you know, I'm happy to be overruled. It just feels too long to me and too detailed. Any guide?
This is Michelle. I don't think we're going to come to a consensus on how long the dissent should be. I think that, as Jim said, we did talk about it could be as long as he wants, as you want. I also personally think it's a little long, but I also think it's not my decision. It's your decision. And I think as long as it's clear that it represents one person, I think that we should err on the side of making sure that dissenting voices are heard.
Yeah, I certainly think the voice should be heard. I'm just a little worried that it's a bit long, but that you make a fair comment, Michelle, that we don't need to reach consensus on the length. And you're right that that I am giving different perspectives over these couple of days as we're adjusting to this, and it's clear. And I've already asked that the SAB office help us work on a clearer policy. So we'll do better moving forward than what we're doing right now. So I guess we'll leave it to you, Jim, to decide whether you're going to shorten it or not. Unless anybody else wants to make a comment. Go ahead, Jim, and then Donica.
I mean, I can commit to going back and rereading to see if I can trim it down, and if I can, I'll submit something shorter. But until I go back and reread it, I won't know.
That's fair. That's a completely fair comment. And again, I'm not saying to remove material. I would just say if you make it shorter, to put it in your individual comments instead. So, Donica.
Yeah, thanks. Jim, I guess the one thing that I wanted to ask, given that Hallie and I were both a little bit confused with what you meant about that one comment, I was wondering if perhaps you could edit it for clarity. And it was, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was related to some acronym that I can't remember right now. And you had responded to Hallie's question, and I just I still felt like I wasn't sure that I fully understood that. And so if there's a way that you can clarify that point, it would be helpful for the public.
So that was about the way that the highest design value is used.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I can add a sentence to clarify that.
Yeah,
what is meant by that.
I just think it would be clear. Thanks. And I'll just add that I think if you can, I don't think you need to remove content, but if you can shorten it, I imagine that people will be more likely to read it in full.
So at a minimum, I know I can immediately remove the graphic because that's in my individual comment, which shortens it by a half a page. But so I'll remove the graphic, but I'll also look to see if there's other pieces that can be shortened.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that, and I also wanted to emphasize. I mean, I'm certainly not trying to muzzle you in any way. As I said, you can get it in the report one way or the other. I think Donica's right, though, that if it's not as long, it's more likely to get the attention that you want it to get. So I think that's another way of looking at this suggestion to make it shorter.
Okay.
Mark, did you have a comment?
I took my hand down because you just made the point I was going to make. I think sometimes shorter is better, not just shorter.
Shorter is better, not just shorter. Okay, I like that one. Let's turn to the consensus comments. And this is a distillation of pretty much what we had in our report for the primary and the secondary, with the opening paragraph pertaining to both, and adding in, as says on lines 12 to 13, that we're not going to provide a point-by-point rebuttal, but only general comments. I'm mostly concerned that we make sure that we talk about anything that we think is needed to be added that is missing. And there's been some a little bit of offline conversation about that already. Terry.
I don't know if I'm on the minority here, but I don't think a rebuttal is appropriate. This is what one dissenter has put out there, and this just repeats what we've already said as a majority. So I don't think it's appropriate. I don't think it's appropriate even.
Well, so that's a good point. And if we go with the SAB examples that at least the charter CASAC were sent, there are no rebuttals in the dissents. This idea, I latched on to it looking at a National Academies report where there is a consensus rebuttal. I think it's appropriate, and what I see as I see that it emphasizes a few things that we did say, but we say them a little bit differently. And so since we took that out of the report, I would hate to have that lost, and I'm not sure that we're in a place to put it back in the report. So at least, and I hear your point about maybe we shouldn't have a rebuttal at all. And so part of thinking process-wise, and the Science Advisory Board office helping us navigate a policy, I think we should address that question. I think you're absolutely right. But personally, I'm in favor of keeping the rebuttal in at least this time. And I appreciate your perspective. But other people, feel free to weigh in. Jennifer.
So I'll say if we keep the rebuttal, I think it's a place that it's important to point out that there is no requirement for the risk assessment, which I don't think it currently does.
Right. And that was one of the things that I was worried was missing. So thank you. Mark.
Yeah, just a correction under the rebuttal line 17 and 18. Furthermore, new evidence has emerged that lung function decrements, increased symptoms, and airway inflammation occur even without exercise. I don't think there were increased symptoms in the Hernandez study.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and I don't recall if they even reported symptoms.
Okay.
that's
I'd have
correct.
to look.
Okay, we'll delete that. I don't remember seeing discussion of that. I didn't look for it either when I looked at their protocol online. Mike. You're muted.
Yeah. I was just gonna say that maybe instead of calling it a rebuttal, we call it clarifying comments.
Okay, we could do that. Then maybe that will help Terry. And that would be good.
I think rebuttal is more accurate.
True.
Very true.
So Alexandra.
I agree that rebuttal is more accurate and I prefer that word.
Okay. So we do need, I think Jennifer's right, we do need to say something about the risk and exposure assessment is not required. And we did have some public comments about that as well yesterday. So we need to come up with that. Do we want to try to do that now?
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
I guess to the committee, you know, there was a risk and exposure assessment for health. I think the majority of the CASAC seems to think it's inadequate to do anything with. And then there is no REA based on EPI, which basically means there's no REA whatsoever to base a recommendation on, according to the majority of the CASAC. And I guess the majority of the CASAC thinks that an REA that standards could be recommended without an REA, that's appropriate way of recommending standards. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think you're hearing that there's, as we heard yesterday, there's actually no requirement that there be a risk and exposure assessment and coming up with a standard. And yes, I think we are arguing that the scientific evidence is sufficient to provide a recommendation.
Right, and I agree there is no requirements. But when you referenced previously the PM standard, the annual standard, the EPI looks at annual numbers, and the standard was an annual average standard, which makes it a little easier to look at EPI relative to the standard. The trick here is, the fourth highest 8-hour daily maximum value averaged over 3 years really looks nothing like the EPI numbers. So there needs to be that translation between the two. And that's really what's missing. And without that piece, I mean, you really just can't quantify what the risk is. And without knowing the risk, it's hard to make a judgment on what is an acceptable risk when determining the adequacy of a standard.
Yeah, thank you. Ed.
Yeah, I just think that I concur with Terry, actually. I think that there's no need and it's not necessary to include a committee rebuttal. I mean, even the first sentence shown here on the screen at line 10 to 11 is sort of innately obvious. I mean, we in the pages above, we've already described what the consensus opinion with the exception of one member is. So there's no, I don't see what this sentence I don't think this sentence is particularly useful. And moreover, I mean, if we have said before that there was one dissenting opinion, we've provided space for that member to make his case. And And then if we're going to come back and rebuttal his case, why not let him come back and rebuttal our case? I mean, this goes into an infinite loop. And so I think we have made our, decision or our determinations in the letter. We provide a space for Jim to make his, and I think, we've laid it out. And that's sufficient.
Okay, George.
I'm agnostic on whether the rebuttal or not. If there's information in here that is not already in the other or rest of the product, then that could be concern. But if it is just a rehash of what we've already said, we don't have to have it. I don't think it hurts to have it. But you also, the discussion of importance of the REA, some of us think that part of the issue here is the EPA relied too heavily on the REA. And I wrote up a few sentences, Leanne, I think, kind of sort of at your request. I don't know if that was this morning. I don't know if you wanted to put those here or somewhere else or nowhere at all, but it seemed like you were kind of heading in that direction. So I thought I'd bring that up.
Yeah, well, if we keep the rebuttal, it seems like it belongs here. If we don't keep the rebuttal, then we may need to make sure that things that, as you said, George, that may be here that aren't elsewhere, are included in our report. And that would be another way to do it. I am looking at the time too. So, Michelle.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm in favor of having a rebuttal and using that wording. I do not feel strongly about it. I'm fine if the group collectively decides not to do this. The reason I think it's useful is because although a lot of the information is discussed elsewhere, here it is speaking specifically to the dissenting view. And I think it is much more clear to have that laid out here than to have it, woven throughout the rest of the document. That's my comment.
Thank you. Donica.
Yeah, hi. I guess I just wanted to add that at least from my brief read of Jim's comments, it seems like he's rebuttaling what we have recommended. And so in that capacity, I think, it could be helpful for us to respond, or for the, I guess, majority opinion to respond to that, to address some of the issues that he raises in his rebuttal. And so I would say in that way, I guess I'm slightly in favor of including it. And I wonder if I haven't read the rebuttal very closely, but I wonder if there are any points in Jim's dissenting view that we need to more directly assess or address in this rebuttal.
And one of the important sentences from my point of view, and one of my concerns with this is that a lot of and maybe this has been updated in Jim's comments since then, but in the previous drafts of the report, the dissenting perspective didn't take into account our deliberations. And frankly, one of the points of having a panel like this and spending these hours together deliberating is that as scientists, as we hear the multiple points of view, our perspectives move and change and get updated. And that is a concern that I had about the dissenting view, and that is reflected in the sentence that is in lines 11 to 12. So that would be one reason why I would want us to keep the rebuttal, is to make sure that we are able to say that. And I agree with Michelle that this is direct and succinct in response to that, as opposed to if it's woven in the report. And there would be no place for that sentence in our report either. Christina.
Yeah, so I'm just agreeing with some of the points that were made earlier in terms of I agree with having a rebuttal. However, changing it so that it directly addresses what the dissenting opinion is, so that we're not just rehashing, the consensus. It really has to be direct in order to be an actual rebuttal. So I just agree with the previous members who have said the same.
Thank you. George, did you want to read the sentences that you proposed for that, since that seems to be one of the major points that Jim is making?
I can read them or send them. Oh, there they are.
Oh, magic.
It isn't that a wonderful? So you can read them yourself.
Well, why don't you read them anyway?
Okay. All right. Okay, this is something that I came up with some encouragement from Leanne to just put forth a 30,000 foot kind of view. This panel is concerned that EPA has been putting increasing weight on the REA in recent years, to the point now for this PA where it dominates the EPA staff's decision process to the exclusion, maybe that's a slightly strong word, of much of the scientific evidence. While the REA is a useful tool to give perspective on the extent of population risk for a given standard, I'll skip Mike's suggested addition here for the moment. The REA should not be the driver when determining what level satisfies the requirements of the Clean Air Act for setting the level of a standard. And then that's similar to Earth Justice comments from yesterday. Dr. Boylan's dissenting position appears to be due largely to his relying on the REA, as did EPA staff, when deciding that the current standards do not need revision. In future NAAQS reviews, we recommend that EPA should better balance the results of the REA with the scientific evidence, such that the REA supplements the scientific evidence instead of dominating it. This is the approach this panel has taken in coming to its conclusion that a revision of the standards is necessary. And then Mike added something to be plopped in there, a suggestion. It is important to recognize that the data derived from the CHEs do not adequately represent the actual exposure atmosphere or the most susceptible individuals in the exposed population. And then kind of a general question here, whether it's to EPA or SAB or whomever. I'm working under the assumption that this is it. We will not have time to see another draft of the PA, but normally when we have this much of a disconnect between all but one of the CASAC and a draft PA, we would, and thus suggesting that the PA needs a major overhaul and another review. But, do we have the option to request that here? Then you get into the issue of dates and politics and administration changes. And I know there is a goal to wrap this up by the end of 2024. And I think if we were to request another draft, that would probably blow that date out of the water. So that's really a very broad question I have for everybody, I guess. What do we want to do? Do we want to just say, look, this is it. We know we won't see another draft, or given the chasm between all but one of the panel and the current draft PA, do we want to see another draft to see what EPA could do with it?
So I think, George, you're absolutely right on one level, and on another level, this is a reconsideration. This is outside the normal process.
Right.
We are trying to do what we have been asked to do, what the administrator stated in his October 2021 announcement. We are doing our best to do that job. We have found challenges on every turn of the way. From the very beginning, when we got a draft policy assessment that we felt like we couldn't look at until we, as the current panel, had reviewed the science. to then reviewing the 2020 ISA and recognizing that our advice had to be clear that we weren't asking them to reopen it because this is a reconsideration. And here we are now with a number of other new wrinkles. I agree with you in an ordinary process. This would obviously result in a new policy assessment. In an ordinary process, we wouldn't get a memo from EPA 5 days before the meeting that we scrambled to provide a public consensus response to as part of this meeting. We're outside of a normal process. So I think that asking for another policy assessment, in my opinion, given we're in the reconsideration and we're doing our darndest to adhere to what the administrator asked to happen, even though we have been part of the delays, but certainly I don't think the main driver of the delays. You know, I think we're doing the best we can and we don't ask for another policy assessment.
And that's fine with me. I understand this is far from a normal review process, so.
But I thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So we can wordsmith this offline, but I think this addresses the REA weight comment that I think is a major thing that is missing from the rebuttal, which I've heard is we should have. In terms of Christina's point in directly addressing the dissent, I agree with you overall. I think the time frame and how much has been changing, including that we've gotten an updated version from Jim and he's going to update it again. It's going to be hard for us to do a point by point direct addressing. So we can try to take out anything that looks more like a rehash and focus more on the key points, of which I think George's proposed addition addresses a pretty major aspect of that. And the other one, I think, is what I mentioned in lines 11 to 12. All right, I'm not seeing any additional comments. I'm not thinking we need to talk about anything else in public. Aaron, do you agree? Or is there anything I missed?
So just to close the loop, it sounds like you're going to keep the rebuttal. You're going to take George's language that he just provided, put that into the rebuttal. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what we, with some potential offline wordsmithing to address Michael's comments and whatever else, since people haven't really had a time to digest it. You know, I think wordsmithing is fine.
Okay, I think that's it. I think you can, unless others have any other comments, I think you can move on to the charter CASAC disposition.
Oh, thank you. See, I knew there was something I was going to forget. All right, so now the end of the meeting, I need to poll the charter CASAC members and find out if you agree with this submitting this draft report with the revisions that we will agree upon. The minor details. We've captured all the major points in public, and minor details can continue to be refined after this disposition. So I want to poll individual members, and I think what I'll do is I'll just go around my screen. I see Christina and Alex have their and Judy have their video on. There's Jim. And so I'm just going to go around and hopefully I don't miss anybody. So Christina, do you agree with submitting this report once it's finalized?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Judy?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Jim?
Yes.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yes, thank you.
Mark?
Yes, I agree.
Oh, Alex?
Yes, I agree.
All right. I don't think I've missed anybody now, have I?
Yourself.
Oh, yes, I agree. Thank you, Aaron. After chairing this meeting, I couldn't not agree, I'm afraid. Okay, so now we have completed our job. I want to again extend my deepest appreciation for all the people who have stepped up to contribute most intensely over the recent days, but throughout the entire process, as well as for the work that EPA has done, which many of us, while we didn't agree with many things, were quite impressed with the work that was done and the arguments and the details that were provided. So I want to express appreciation to everyone and the members of the public for providing their comments and helpful input that was useful for us to hear. I see that Ed has his hand up, so I will invite him to add comments.
No, I'd just like to thank you for all the leadership and guidance, and also ask you from you or an Aaron, the timeline for any final wordsmithing, submittals, etc.
Yeah, so we'll follow up offline, but I would say within the next several days, we'll give you deadlines on sending in any final editorial comments, typos, those kinds of things. Then what we will do is we will send out clean and track changes versions from the May 2nd draft so that you can see all the changes that were made. And then we would just ask you to kind of review that and make sure that we captured all the changes that were discussed. But at that point, we're not asking for any new additions other than what was discussed in this meeting, other than clarifications, typos, those kinds of things.
And certainly if we miss anything in that version, we want you to point it out. There have been a lot of moving parts, so we're trying to do our best to capture everything, but something might have gotten missed. So Jennifer.
I'll add my thanks to you, Leanne, for your leadership, and also ask you and Aaron if I know I've been tasked to write something, and it would be really helpful to get a current version, what I'm supposed to be editing, just to make sure I'm on the right version.
Yes, and I've been tracking changes throughout this as well, so I will send that out and give it to you as well as others who had writing assignments.
All right. Thank you very much. I think, unless there's any last comments anybody wants to make, I think I can turn it over to Aaron to adjourn the meeting.
So this is the last meeting of the panel, so I just wanted to express appreciation again for all of your hard work, especially over these last few days. I know a lot of us have been working over the weekend as well as late into the evening to get all these draft pieces together, and we would not have finished the disposition of this report within these 2 days, had it not been for Leanne's leadership, as well as all the hard work of everyone over the weekend and over the last several nights as well. So just thank you again, everybody, for all your hard work. Thank you, EPA, for all your hard work as well in cranking these documents out. And thank all the members of the public for your participation. We could be adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great week.
Leanne, thanks again. Oop, we lost her. Thanks, Aaron.
Yep. Thank you, George.